and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary Salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And we're joined today by Dr. Tara McCormack, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester. Welcome, Tara.
Hello, thank you both for inviting me.
We're really pleased to have you. And we met you at the like.Get conference that we talked about in one of our previous episodes. And I know you've always been interested in these ideas around international relations and how they fit in with sovereignty. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk to you about, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
So I think you suggested that we might talk about the idea of what do international relations look like in the context of the British national interest and in the context of democratic control of international relations. So do you want to maybe just start us off on that route and see where we get to?
Yeah, I just wondered if I can just jump in quickly just to say this idea of foreign policy, I think, and this kind of came across when we were talking beforehand via email, is this idea of, should a country have a foreign policy? What does it mean to have a foreign policy?
Yeah, so maybe start there. That's probably a priori argument, isn't it, as they say?
Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
You have to do that first.
Oh, okay.
Should we have a foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, so what is foreign policy? It is, I guess, put very simply, the way in which a state will behave abroad, the policies that it'll choose to pursue and enact, and for what purpose. And for what purpose? Well, certainly in modern times, and I have quite a loose definition of modern times, the argument has been that states should be acting abroad in the pursuit of their national interests. Obviously, that raises another question. Well, what is a national interest and how do we work it out? And that's what I want to come back to, because that's a good question. Historically, or sort of in terms of analysis and discussion, we've tended to understand national interests from a critical perspective. National interests have tended to be representative of certain group interests within a nation that are then portrayed as universal, or to be portrayed as national. So you might take an example of 19th century industrialists who would argue that policies that would suit them would be in the national interest. So that would be, I guess, how one would think about national interest critically. So there's always been a question over it. The term is quite a problematic one, because immediately one's thinking, okay, well, what does it mean? Well, historically, it's tended to be portraying specific interests as national interests. What would it mean to have really foreign policy that would be based on national interests? I guess we would have to be thinking about some kind of democratic control and oversight of foreign policy. What those policies would be, I don't know, because that would be something that would emerge, one would hope, out of debate and contestation, a real democratic debate and contestation. I think the problem for us is that in Britain, we have never had a democratic foreign policy. Post 45, and there are a lot of strands to this, so I'm going to put it in quite a brutally crude way. Since the end of World War II, our foreign policy has essentially been folded into American foreign policy, as I would argue has most of Europe's foreign policy. And we can see that through NATO, of course, also through the European Union, or the Economic Coal and Steel Community, as it was called in the 50s. The Marshall Plan, of course. So there were several strands to the way in which European elites essentially, well, hitched their foreign policy to America's, or American foreign policy essentially dictated much European foreign policy. Now, this was all done outside of the democratic realm. You know, we were not asked this. There was no real democratic contestation, for example, over joining NATO. Other foreign policy decisions, for example, America basically controls British nuclear missiles, and this was set in place in the 50s. So I should have had the details to hand, with an agreement between Britain and America, and this agreement has essentially been maintained over the decades.
And can you elaborate on that? Not to push too hard for details, but most people would think, you know, we have control over our own nuclear missiles, and if we wanted to launch one, that's up to us. What role does America play in that?
So I think this is a really fundamental part of our polity that is very little known about. So yes, in principle, the Prime Minister of the day can make a decision to launch nuclear missiles from the Trident submarine, several of which are all three, I can't remember, are always at sea, in principle. In reality, this will never happen outside of a NATO framework. But so I think there is that debate. But I think what I'm specifically talking about is that there is quite a complex agreement between the US and the UK, whereby, for example, the UK nuclear parts of the system are leased from America, basically. The missiles have to return to America for maintenance. So in essence, we do not fully own and control our nuclear missiles. We have a semi-rental situation. I'm going to put it very, very crudely. Yeah, and it's an interesting part of our...
Could you not argue, though, that system of international cooperation on defence and having a kind of a global perspective on international relations has actually been the thing that has kept the peace? So if we look at a situation when perhaps that broke down, so this is not my field of expertise, but I'm just trying to remember times when perhaps it broke down in my memory. So when you look at, for example, when Yugoslavia was breaking up and different European powers like Germany and the UK perhaps took different sides in some of those local conflicts, that was when things got very much to the state where you kind of saw different European states perhaps pushing up against each other, which to me feels more scary and you know, more potentially international conflict causing than when you have that kind of international cooperation.
Yeah, I think that that probably is a different. That is a good point about Yugoslavia. You definitely did see quite a bit of contestation, and I think one of the problems around the Yugoslav breakup was that it was highly internationalized from the start. Again, often this is something that's just not understood or discussed. But I think in terms of, you know, is it not a positive thing to have an international perspective? Well, I think, yes, in a different world. But I mean, the reality is that NATO, for example, is a specific vehicle used by the American state to maintain hegemony over the European continent. For example, we can see that there's a lot of discussion, which won't happen, But there's, I think, a bit of sort of propagandistic discussion from Europe, that has run throughout the 90s. Europe needs its own fighting force and so on. But who would control that? I mean, you couldn't have, in an ideal world, you could have a genuinely neutral fighting force. But in reality, any significant military institution is essentially dominated by powerful states. And I guess, again, it's obviously this is a very complex question, thinking about what happened during the Cold War. Did NATO maintain the peace? I mean, that's very debatable in terms of how one understands Cold War history, thinking about NATO's role, certainly in the early days of the post-war period, essentially putting down uprisings in Italy and Greece, establishing a very specific form of economic and political order. And of course, one can argue, well, that was better than the alternative. I guess that's always the...
Yeah.
So I wouldn't particularly argue, I guess, that international consensus leads to resolution or peace. I mean, I would look actually at the extremely strong consensus in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And interesting to compare that to international responses to Israel. But again, that might not be something we want to do. But what we have seen is that from the start of the conflict, the international consensus has been to refuse negotiations with Russia and to push Ukraine to keep fighting, to the extent that Boris Johnson even went to Kiev. I think this was in spring 23. At the point, was it or 22 or 23? I'll look that up so you can edit it. When Boris
22.
Johnson went to Kiev, there were negotiations occurring in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine, and Boris Johnson essentially was sent to Kiev to say, well, you might be ready to stop fighting, but we're not. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of, yes, what are the consequences of an international consensus, and essentially who's managing that consensus? And I don't mean that in a trite way, but once we start to think about how the international order works and how power works within that, I think it's very hard to believe, or I think it's doubtful that there is possibility for some kind of neutral force.
So if we sort of go back a little bit into, the I guess the birth of foreign policy, but in terms of the way that countries have enacted foreign policy over the hundreds of years, in the past it was a key part of that was to protect themselves militarily, and at the time when we had empire, you would have coalitions. The coalition against Napoleon, for example, and that was an attempt to protect your own population from being invaded, but also territory, and to conquer as much territory as possible. And if we now have a very different world, and certainly post Second World War, where we have this consensus around borders and around sovereignty, and this has come up a lot in the Russia-Ukraine argument, because people like Boris Johnson would say, we're defending Ukraine's sovereignty when we give them this financial support, especially. I suppose that we are in the infancy in some ways of this new era, and we have to have friends, perhaps. And the way that I often think that we see foreign policy, certainly in the public discourse, but in the news, is we have certain countries that are considered our friends, like the US, for example, and they talk about the special relationship. And it's almost as if that's set in stone, like that can't possibly change. And I find that a very odd thing, because it's, you look back to, right now when there's an issue between China and Japan, we would see us being on the side of Japan, right, and China as being a potential enemy. But you only have to go back to the Second World War when it was the complete reverse of that. So these things are fluid and they change. And I wonder, how do you think we should be deciding who to align ourselves with?
Yeah. So I just wanted to just a quick sort of interjection, and then to go to that. I think one post 45, we do see a new world order of formerly sovereign states. You know, we break up the old empires, etc. But those borders and that sovereignty, you know, those have always been, all sovereignties are not equal, either post 45 and certainly not post 90 with the end of the Cold War. So some sovereignties have been defended, some borders have not, some have been expendable. And Yugoslavia is a good example, actually. I know, very, very controversial, well, maybe less so decades on, whereas the federal state of the borders of the federal state were decreed by the EU, by America, to be invalid, but the borders of the constituent republics were considered to be sacrosanct. So, you know,
until Kosovo, of course.
Sorry?
Until Kosovo, of course, in 2008.
Yes, well, Kosovo did. That is true. Kosovo did in the 90s. Kosovo also wished to secede and was told no, because that was perhaps seen as slightly too destabilising. So I guess my only point is these have always been, you know, we have had a world post 45 in which we have for the first time had the main legitimate form of political organisation is the territorially bounded state. But it's always been very relative. I said some sovereignties have been, so, you know, not all sovereignties have been equal. To go to the special relationship, I think, again, I would understand that in that post 45 context of American hegemony, basically. And I don't think you have to be Noam Chomsky to look at the world and understand that this is how things have worked post 45. I would argue, I think the special relationship trope, sorry, a bit of an favoured academic term, is something that's a bit more for domestic consumption, really, than reality. I mean, we are part of the Five Eyes alliance, which is the Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America, and the UK, which in principle meant to have sort of particularly special close intelligence relationship. But the truth is that America has a special relationship with Germany, with France, with Japan, with Israel, you know. So I think that term is much more for us, really. This idea of, again, post 45, you know, we are Greece to America's Rome, you know, we are the kind of advisors and the, you know, so I think that of that in terms of, do we have a special relationship? I mean, yes, but so do many Western NATO states have a special close relationship with the
they're like the cool kid in the playground that everyone thinks they're best friends with, right?
The biggest power, you know. It's like, it's not entirely, but yes, should we even think about such things? Does it make sense in terms of foreign policy? I mean, I would say in principle, no. You know, again, relationships, alliances would be something that should, at least in principle, be subject to democratic debate, should be decided. But again, I don't think that's something that would be possible for Britain. I don't think it's something that any of the British elite would wish for, that's for sure, but it wouldn't be possible at the moment, or the elite as it exists. Maybe if the SDP
take over. Yeah.
I remember listening to a debate in Parliament on the Chagos Islands deal, and there were a couple of people that were opposing it on I think Farage stood up and said something about it, and a couple of others. And I remember watching, and David Lammy, as the Foreign Secretary, was responding, and I was shocked at something he said, which was, it was something like, he was putting the case forward that the Americans had looked at this deal and were really happy with it, and he was trying to sell it to Parliament by saying the Americans think it's brilliant and therefore it's a good deal. And obviously the Americans were happy because they still get to keep the base. And he said something, it was quite a sneering comment, but he said, I think I'm going to listen to our closest partners across the pond rather than members across from me. And I thought that was really revealing, because he, and whether you want to call them, the establishment or the political elites, they see that they have more in common, or certainly more of an alliance with those across the pond in America than they do with their own elected representatives that are sitting in the House with them.
I would say, I mean, I have my own opinions on the Chagos Island and sovereignty, but I would say that is a great quote, and that does really, it is indicative of how both parties that have essentially, well, more or less been in power since 1945 have understood their primary interests.
Is that changing now, though? Not because we decided anything, but because it does feel that America is kind of backing away from its kind of global policeman state, and it seems to be not just being America first, but perhaps the Western world first.
So I think that is a really interesting question. So one of Trump's sort of rhetorical propositions, if that's quite right, one of his messages during both campaigns was to draw back on America's kind of endless interventions, endless wars. Whether that's quite played out is debatable. There have been some notable things. In 2017, Trump shut down a massive multi-billion-dollar scheme to fund Al-Qaeda and friends in Syria. It was called Operation Timber Sycamore. You can Google it. And he'd always been a critic of America's role in the Syrian conflict. Now, of course, Al-Qaeda runs Syria, and we're all friends with al-Jolani, but that's a topic for another day. So there were some interesting signs, but whether he really succeeded in disentangling America, I think, is quite debatable, certainly in the first administration. When Trump was campaigning to be president this last time, again, he was super critical of America's role in terms of Ukraine. He was constantly tweeting, Biden's going to take us into World War III. We need to, famously said, I'll have this war sorted out in 24 hours, which obviously is ridiculous. And he didn't. But there were certain shifts. Certainly there seems to be much more of a willingness to discuss things with Russia. There seems to be much more of an open discussion that this is indeed, or was indeed, a proxy war, which again, lots, people will sometimes get very angry, say it's not a proxy war. Well, it is a proxy war. So there seems to be much more openness. He has, for example, stopped Ukraine from using delightfully termed ATACMS, which are basically, it's an American missile system that can go deep into Russia, that relies entirely on American intelligence to be used. So thereby potentially America's being a direct participant in the conflict because it relies entirely on American intelligence and so on. So that's all quite interesting. And then what we've had just now is a new national defence strategy has just been published, or it hasn't been released, but a couple of days ago it was reported that it's coming out. And this is really interesting. So this was basically run by a guy called Elbridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary for Policy for Defence, or some kind of title like that, and he was part of the first Trump administration as well. Now, Colby has always been very, very critical of America's role in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, for example, saying, we shouldn't be making an enemy of Russia, etc. But his argument has always been, we need to focus on China. China is the big competitor. China will be our enemy. But I haven't read the new report, but it's been reported in Politico and various other places. And what it's suggesting is that the US will be prioritising the homeland, i.e. America, and the Western Hemisphere over China and Russia. So if this is true, so this is a long-winded way of getting back to the initial question. If this is true, that would be very significant. I mean, bad luck for Latin America. Sorry, guys, but then I guess they're used to that. But if that is true, that is a really significant shift, both from Trump's initial administration, in which China was talked up as a big threat, but potentially in terms of drawing down troops, for example, from Europe, rethinking about NATO. Again, we know that NATO has been a long-running bone of contention. I mean, even Obama was complaining about the Europeans not stumping up enough for NATO. But this will be really something to watch, I think, if this genuinely is a new strategy. It could signify a very significant post-Cold War, well, it would sort of be a transformation of post-Cold War defence policy from America.
And where does that leave us? Because it feels sort of like, I don't know, to me it feels like Trump and America are sort of stepping back a bit, like you said. They're not willing to play that role anymore. And yet we're still pretending that the old order exists and that we have to be friends with them in order to protect ourselves, to maintain our sovereignty, which is sort of a bit of an oxymoron, I suppose.
Well, I think this goes back to the fundamental question about what would a democratic foreign policy look like? And that would be something we'd have to have a debate and a discussion about. That would have to be a sort of democratic contestation. And I think we are very, very, very ill-served by our media. Particularly when it comes to foreign policy, we do not have reporting when it comes to foreign policy, and that is a very significant problem.
Why do we not?
Well, I think that over the course, things have definitely got a lot worse, I would say, in the last 20 years. I mean, during the Cold War, maybe had a bit more contestation. In the 90s, I mean, I remember reading John Pilger. John Pilger.
That's exactly the name that was in my head. We used to have John Pilger. Why do we not know?
Who's John Pilger?
People might hate John Pilger, but he was definitely a critic. But what we've seen over the last 25 years is that sort of space narrowing and narrowing. I think Iraq I don't really know enough. I think Iraq was probably quite pivotal in transforming reporting. We could think a bit more randomly, or not randomly, but for example, the Guardian, and was it the Washington Post that broke the Snowden revelations? Was that 2013? And after that, basically the British, and this is all reported, this is not the British Secret Services went into the Guardian offices, seized everything, and the Guardian has quite significantly, not again that I would think the Guardian's going to save us all, but the Guardian has quite significantly narrowed its scope as well of discussion when it comes to foreign policy.
So for Sebastian's benefit, John Pilger was...
He's an Australian-British filmmaker and journalist, and always super critical of British and American foreign policy. I mean, he was Australian-British. He was originally from Australia. I think lived in the UK. But, you know, you'd kind of, if you read some of his columns now, you'd think, wow, I cannot believe this was actually in a mainstream newspaper.
But critical in a knowledgeable way, not critical in the kind of, you know, the very knee-jerk way that many of our journalists are now, that's not very well informed.
Yeah.
So again, one doesn't have to like him, but it's just, I think there has been quite a significant narrowing of what is allowed in the papers. I mean, I get that's a big discussion, but I think that is also an issue for us in terms of media coverage, that the public square, when it comes to foreign policy, is very strictly policed.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to imagine in my head what democratically controlled foreign policy looks like. And this might sound very sniffy and a bit anti-democratic, but I would just worry that it either looks like intervening in every humanitarian problem around the world, or it looks like Little Britain, we're not doing anything. And I suspect neither of those are the right answer, but I feel that that's maybe where a democratic input to foreign policy, that's what it might look like.
I mean, it's really difficult. I know this is probably a bad podcast on my behalf, or bad thing said on a podcast, because I don't know what it would look like. I don't know what a properly democratic foreign policy would look like. But I mean, just on one of the things that I think we do need to note is that Britain is hyperactive militarily, hyperactive. You can find statistics. I think there have only been a couple of years post World War I where Britain has not been involved militarily. We have special forces in, again, it's not reported. The investigative magazine Declassified is one of the few places that put it. We have special forces in at least, I think, 10 states at any one time. So we are absolutely, we're special forces in Ukraine, for example. We've been there. We've run entire missions in Ukraine. Wow. They've been pretty disastrous. I'm not just saying this; they've been really disastrous. I
remember. I think it was one of the presidential debates, and Trump said something like, I think it might have been Trump that said we've pulled out all our. We have no active servicemen anywhere, or something like that. And there was a video posted online of some guys from the army, I think, that were stationed somewhere, and they as a reaction, and they were like, "What? What are we doing then?" But you're right that it's a lot of the time the ones that get reported about the conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, there are a lot more that we don't even know about, or when they are reported, it's pushed under the carpet a little bit, where we do have a presence in many different parts of the world, and especially America. I mean, we're not a big player compared to America.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, American Special Forces, I mean, this is because America has a little bit better democratic oversight of many of these covert methods. So the last 10 years have been, as one academic has called it, the golden age of special forces. States have increasingly been using special forces. Particularly America has been a massive expansion of the use of special forces. Mm-hmm. So just to go back to that, I think, one of the things that we don't really understand in Britain about our own country, about our own foreign policy, is that we are one of the most militarily active states.
So what we're told is that well, not necessarily by government, but by the people who are critical of our current defence position, is that we have a tiny army. We've not got enough people to really do anything anywhere. We've got 75,000 people in the army
who wouldn't fit in that stadium behind
exactly.
us, Old Trafford.
Yeah. It's just not big enough to do anything. And those people who perhaps are the hawks might say, you know, we really need to beef up our defence capability. But you're saying we've got all these special forces that presumably aren't included in that 75,000 who...
No, but that is but both are true.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, both are true. Yeah, we have a very small army, and you know, we can go around, as did happen, you know, with say yes, we need to be ready to fight Russia, China, and Iran all at once. Okay, what with our handful of soldiers? So both are true. So special forces, again, this is quite separate. Special forces are, I don't mean this, special forces are a sort of cheap option, because they aren't democratically overseen or scrutinised. When you send off soldiers to somewhere, we know. Mm-hmm. And this is also why America likes them. So you can pack off your special forces. There's no democratic oversight. When special forces die, it's all covert. So they are increasingly a favoured option. So both are true. You know, we are an extremely militarily active state in terms of using special forces, air power, etc. But it is also true that our standing army is very small.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess for us as Democrats, the question is, well, what do we want to spend our money on?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, this idea of democratic accountability when it comes to foreign policy, because I think it's the one area where you can really test it's like a litmus test for how much of a Democrat you are. And I think even us, I think you can sense that we're sort of like, okay, how democratic can you be with something like foreign policy? I just wondered, so it's something we were talking about a few months back, where we did a podcast episode talking about, I think about Trump's comments on Ukraine. And since Trump really was elected in 2016 and this current political period that we're in, I think a lot of it has been one side saying, we're going to do this, or let's say Trump fans looking at Trump, and the other side saying, he said some awful things. And they're like, but we don't care, right? We don't care what he says. We care about what he does. And I think that's been a very difficult thing for the media and, let's say, the establishment to get their heads around. Now, one area where I question myself was with foreign policy, because it seems like what you say really is important. So when Trump came out with comments about Zelensky being a dictator and having started the war and stuff like that, which, we can debate about, but I think was quite false. But you could say that's just Trump being silly and his usual sort of bombastic self. But these things do matter because, and I guess the difference then, if we're thinking about democratic control and your ability to actually affect change, is with domestic policy, it comes down to the government. The government can do what they wish to do, or certainly we would hope so, right? That's what we want. Whereas foreign policy, it's sort of like the future is sort of reliant on other countries' actions, and so what you say might change their actions.
Yeah, well, but what we can make a decision about is, I think that's true. And then again, as we're saying, we have this broader post-45 hegemonic structure. Again, so I'm not trying to channel Chomsky here. But what we can do is make decisions that should be democratically discussed here. It's true, we can't control other countries, but we can make a decision about how at least it would be good if we could make decisions about how we would want to approach other countries. What would our policies be? I'll just give you, here's an example, a specific example, or I hope it will be a good example. So in the sort of dying days of the Biden administration, there was the decision made, as I mentioned, for America to permit Ukraine to use these ATACMS. All American weapons have these lovely acronyms that could reach deep into Russia. Now, we and the French also supply Ukraine with what are called Storm Shadow missiles, which again can be fired deep into Russia. But again, they rely on NATO, it relies on NATO intelligence, NATO data, satellites, etc., to be used. So again, potentially signifying Britain becoming a full participant in the conflict. Now, I remember the debate, it was kind of quite feverish, or not, but it's feverish about, will America allow Ukraine to use ATACMS? And linked to it was a French-British decision whether to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadows missiles. But what was interesting was that this was not a question put to Parliament, but literally Starmer went to Washington to discuss it. And I think whether one agrees with that policy or not, that, again, a bit like Lami's comment, that seems to signify something quite profound. Okay, if we're going to fire long-range missiles into Russia, a nuclear-armed state, 9,000 or so nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, that might, call me old-fashioned, that should be a decision that is put to the British people. And I guess it's easy to say, okay, well, yes, but we know that would be popular. I don't know. Would it be popular? If people really said, okay, do you want to potentially go to war with Russia over who runs Kiev? I don't know that it would be a wildly popular. It might be, but...
Yeah, I guess being a fan of representative democracy over direct democracy, I would say that the job of the political parties is to outline a foreign policy vision. And then that platform is elected and they have the mandate to then do these things and make the individual decisions under the context and the circumstances when necessary.
Yeah, and to go back to, and so that's a proper concern. To go back to Hilary's question about what would a democratic foreign policy, intervening in everything, there's a word for it, would it be like X factor foreign policy, that if people were deciding on responding to everything. But I still would argue that many aspects of our foreign policy are not discussed democratically. So whilst I agree with how you frame representative democracy, of course, the government cannot ask people about everything, and we don't live in Switzerland. But there is very little discussion. And again, it's all foreign policy actions are framed in very specific ways so as to preclude democratic debate. This is for humanitarian reasons. This is the West fighting for civilization, whatever, take your pick. You can have a number of framings, but this is all done specifically to preclude any kind of political debate. Well, this isn't a conflict, this is done for X, Y, Z. So yes, I agree on the representative democracy question. I think there is a question of, well, how would you do it? Press yes for this policy, press no. That would be quite difficult, obviously. But at the same time, there is such a lack of any kind of democratic debate. And there should be some decisions, surely, such as sending missiles into a nuclear armed state, that if Brexit merited a referendum, potential conflict with a nuclear armed state there's a whole discussion about parliamentary war powers as well, which was something that slightly raised its head for a few years and then was stamped down.
We're opening loads of doors here. I think it's just
that's why I said not to go into that.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. It just shows there's so many avenues to explore. I just wonder, because I think we would say as a party, the SDP, we are sort of non-interventionist, but also internationalist in outlook. Do you think that sort of platform could be communicated to the British people?
Yes. Yeah. I think yes, but I think the first step towards being internationalist would have to be in terms of getting more of a hold on our own foreign policy. We have to work out our own policies, try and think about how can these be made more democratic without, having to have a referendum every day. Before we can then look out into the world and think, okay, well, what is it that we want to do? What is it that we can do? I mean, yes, but probably it won't be a shock from what I've said. My sentiments would definitely be on the non-interventionist end.
So I suppose that's a plea for at least more public discussion and potentially more parliamentary discussion on defence, international relations more widely. And
things being on the table, like our relationship with the US, let's discuss that. It seems like it's something that people are just completely unwilling to discuss in the media as if it's a complete given, whereas conversation today shows that you can discuss these things and have, if it's a good policy, then you should be able to get some sort of democratic consensus for it.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, but I think that's true. But I think, what we do see is less and less discussion, as I've said, or just for example, it seems to be that America has now placed nuclear missiles back in Britain.
Yes,
we all know we can all remember that. Well, not all of us. The Greenham Common, the big conflict over American missiles, which were eventually removed, and now it seems that they have been brought back. And there is zero discussion.
Yeah.
There is zero parliamentary discussion. And again, you might think that's fine. And to go back to your point, if that's a good policy, make it public. But the government don't want to make it public. They're thinking, God, we're not going to rerun Greenham Common. Heck no. So zero discussion in Parliament. And that's also a significant problem within our Parliament. I don't think anyone is more critical of the British media than I am, but what are our representatives doing as well? So that's a really big that's an interesting kind of contemporary issue that is happening with absolutely zero discussion.
You kind of undermined me a little bit there, Tara, because we do try to finish on a slight positive.
Sorry.
And talking about solutions rather than all the negatives. So I'm going to try again to bring us round to... I think there is a debate and a discussion and a fight to be had about how we make sure that some of these things are on the table and how we can make sure that they are discussed and debated with the British public.
Absolutely. And I think you've mentioned it a couple of times, but the national interest, we interviewed Philip Cunliffe a month or two ago. Yeah. A lot of this sounds very Cunliffian.
We like that.
I've known Phil for a long time, so I won't flatter him by saying that.
Great.
Good.
Thanks, Tara. That was really, really interesting. I think one of the more meaty topics that we've tackled over the past few weeks. So I'm sure people might want to listen to that a couple of times to really get their heads around some of those things. So moving on to Culture Club. And I think you want to talk about something a bit less intellectually challenging, don't you, Sebastian? You've been babysitting.
I have. I've been babysitting my niece and nephew this weekend. And this is just a small addition to Culture Club because I thought it's Australian, But I think it says something positive about culture, because I'm quite negative about the way we're going culturally often. So this is a show called Bluey. Are you familiar with Bluey, Tara?
My child is just a little bit too old for it. So when Bluey, he was past it. But I am familiar with the cartoon. Yeah.
I don't think anybody is too old for Bluey.
I don't know about it at all, I'm afraid. I'll have to research
I put
this.
it on. It's the sort of thing they watch in the evening just as they're winding down before bed. And I find I put it on thinking, right, I'll leave that with them and then I'll go do some work. And I find myself watching it, 2 or 3 episodes later, and I'm still hooked. So it's very short episodes. It's about a dog called Bluey, who has a younger sister, and it's about their family of dogs. And they're really positive messages, and it's not soppy. That's what I like about it. Mm-hmm. It's not the sort of cliched soppy messages, but there's life lessons, and there's some really good parenting on show. And I think often the TV depictions, certainly TV shows that you see, I don't know whether it's the Real Housewives of Cheshire or something, but there's often you turn TV on, or when I'm at the gym, I see it on the screen, I just think, is this what people are watching? This is so negative, and everybody's sort of out to get each other. And so to watch a show with good messages, I think is really lovely. And it's also an indication that I think we can have rose-tinted glasses, and I think that the TV I was watching when I was a kid was the best, right, when I was growing up. But actually there's some really good stuff being made, like Bluey.
Okay, I will have to make an effort to watch that, Sebastian. It's I confess, it passed me by.
And it's got a very addictive theme tune as well.
Oh, right, okay. Give us a bit of a blast. Okay.
And I actually did that when we were, I think my brother pointed this out to me when I tried to sing our theme song, I tried to hum our theme tune for the podcast.
Yeah.
About 6 months ago. My brother texted me and said, "You realise that was the Bluey theme tune?" I was like, "Oh, okay."
Okay, great. Well, talking about retro TV, Tara, you wanted to mention a retro TV topic, didn't you?
I think I too tend to be a bit negative about a lot of contemporary cultural products. But one thing I have been watching with my teenage son is a real retro blast and blast, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was made in the 90s, mid to late 90s. He seems to enjoy it. And I didn't watch it the first time round. I think I was a bit too sniffy the first time round and thought I was too old for it. But it's actually quite good fun and very interesting, I guess, depiction of Buffy and her incredible strength and, foiling various plots to bring on the apocalypse. So it's a sort of surprisingly good watch, I must say.
And I think that depiction of a kind of autonomous, powerful woman is something that I think we need more of these days. We seem to see a lot of depictions of women on screen now that are very much about women who need to be looked after. And I think going back to somebody who doesn't need any looking after is a good thing.
Well, actually, I haven't really looked into it, but I might do a bit more because now I'm into Buffy. There's a reboot happening of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where I think she's going to be portrayed as very introverted, because in the original series, I think that's part of the whole joke. She's quite a bubbly blonde in many senses, but she's also a vampire slayer and can kick demons' butt, and is extremely strong. But she's called Buffy, and she's this sort of light, bubbly blonde. So there's that sort of juxtaposition. But yes, apparently in the reboot she'll be portrayed as very introverted, which perhaps symptomatic of our times.
Indeed, yeah. As you're speaking then, Tara, we had the usual Manchester background noise of thunder and lightning and very, very heavy rain. So apologies to viewers and listeners if you can hear that in the background. It's one of the things that we have to deal with in Manchester.
There's some workmen on the roof of Tesco just outside our office window, and when the rain started, I saw them running across the roof to try and get some shelter. There's a lot going on around our office.
Absolutely.
Okay, your item for Culture Club.
I just wanted to mention Moulin Rouge, because I think last time we did a podcast, I was saying that I was dashing off that evening to see Moulin Rouge. I think I mentioned it in passing. So a little report back in case people were wondering how it went.
And it's a musical.
This is a musical. It's the Baz Luhrmann film.
Oh,
and
based
this
on a
is
film, right.
yeah, and this is the on-stage musical version of it, which has some extra songs in it.
And what was it about?
So it's Moulin Rouge, you know, which is the kind of nightclub, the French Parisian nightclub, and there's an evil baddie, and there's a good male lead as well, and you know, obviously it's a kind of play-off between those. I don't want to give any spoilers away, although it's probably very obvious how it's going to end up. But there's loads of songs in it, and the thing that I thought was great is that there's songs from so many different generations. I took a friend with me who's not a musical fan at all, and she was very, very nervous about going and thinking, I'm not going to enjoy this at all. And she absolutely loved it. So there's things like T-Rex, Children of the Revolution, you know, right up, and then through things like Your Song, Elton John, right up to the present day, and Adele and things like that. And it's just got so many, such a wide range of music in it. And there's lovely dancing and costumes and everything that you want from a musical, really. I love a musical. So we had a fantastic night out at the Palace Theatre in Manchester. It's touring, so if it comes to somewhere near you, do go and see it.
Excellent.
Big recommendation from me.
Yeah, definitely. I do remember the film. I did watch the film. When you said it now, then it came back to when it was out.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for listening. See you again next week. And as always, follow the show, recommend the show, like the show, subscribe, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.